Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Mike Avenel here from CA Product Management. Mike is going to lead us through today's Service Management Community Webcast, Winning the Software License Management Game with CA IT Asset Manager. It's a mouthful. All right, Mike, you can go ahead and start.
All right, well, good morning and afternoon to everybody. I appreciate everybody taking time out of your busy days to join us on this discussion around what it takes to win or to be successful with software asset management or software license management. Just a quick introduction. I'm on the product management team at CA, part of the service management product group, and I generally focus on all things IT asset manager related to ITSM and, of course, software asset management. I've been with the company for 10 years, and before that I was an audit specialist, if you will, within the same space for a number of years. So hopefully this is beneficial and meaningful to you today, and with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So just a quick overview. This presentation is part of a larger workshop that we call Software Asset Management Jumpstart. And so I've selected some of the content from that material that represents some of the critical success factors in implementing a sustainable SAM or software license management program. So this is not meant to be comprehensive in any way, because I think it would take us a full day really to cover off this topic in the most appropriate way, but we'll cover the majority of the high points today. So there are a number of software asset management drivers or business drivers that would typically compel customers to consider a software asset management program. Those drivers include audit risk, without question. We've been saying for probably the better part of 10 or 15 years that it's the year of the audit, and that audits delivered by vendors or by their delegates, the industry associations, have been on the increase for year over year for a countless number of years now. And while the landscape around auditing is changing, especially in light of cloud proliferation and kind of other modern trends and technologies, it still represents one of the most significant drivers within this space. Then from there, it would be cost or cost optimization, and that really kind of focuses in two areas. One is to reduce our investment, right, to look for hard dollar savings, and examples of that would be avoiding unnecessary spend. But the other half of that coin would be to be able to obtain as much value from the investments that we've already made in software, right? So cost optimization in general is a key driver within this space. And then there is internal governance or organizational governance. These would be internal requirements that drive the need to get clarity around our software estate. And there are a number of examples that I can give you. Risk and regulatory requirements. This is often more vertically oriented in the financial industry or in health services, obviously government. There are a number of different legal and regulatory requirements that play a significant role. If you look, kind of harkening back to software audits, there's an agreement obviously associated with the purchase and use of software, and while it's rare, audits can go as far as litigation, and so there's always that consideration. And then a newer one that I guess has begun to kind of burgeon is around cybersecurity, with the cloud playing such a prominent role, and a clear fact that more and more customers are migrating significant portions of their software portfolio to the cloud. There's a significant intersection between SAM and cybersecurity, so that's beginning to become more prominent as a driver within the SAM space. So with that said, some of the key objectives that we are driving to in implementing a SAM program would be first and foremost transparency. it is a long-standing challenge to really get an understanding of what it is we're actually, what software we actually own and what our rights are. We call them product use rights, but what our rights are in terms of the deployment, use, and distribution of software in general. And then, of course, not just what we own, but then understanding our usage patterns, whether it's install-based or user-based or now even cloud-based or service-based subscriptions through cloud service providers. So gaining transparency is certainly a clear objective with any SAM program. Establishing a license position and determining whether or not we're compliant with the terms and conditions of the agreements that govern our use of software is another important element and key objective. And then lastly, and this aligns with the business driver that we called cost optimization, is exploring or exposing the potential for cost savings, for what we typically refer to as optimization. Again, how can I reduce my spend, or how can I get more value out of the investments that I've already made? So with those in mind, I want to talk about some critical success factors for a program and implementing this. And this goes beyond an audit response program, right, where a customer would be served or where a letter would be sent to the customer indicating they'd be audited. When I talk about critical success factors, I'm referring more toward a sustainable program that would enable us in a business as usual or steady state mode to be able to effectively manage our software estate and, of course, address the needs of the various sponsors and stakeholders to which we're responsible. So one of the first critical factors, and there are a number of them, I'm going to touch on some of the key factors today, but is really defining the program in general. And there are a couple of different elements to that, and I want to, I guess, just spend a few minutes on each of those. And I'm noticing an error in this slide, and I'm going to have to change it out, Mr. Hackett, but it is supposed to say employ an entitlement-centric approach as opposed to an asset-centric approach. So that's a little embarrassing there, but the idea here is historically the view of asset management and software license management has been what we call asset-centric. And what we mean by that is most of the tools, the software solutions that are available in the market were historically focused on identifying a physical asset and then determining what software is installed on that asset, and then kind of backing into an understanding of what that represents in terms of the licenses needed to be compliant. A more accurate and more reliable approach or method for managing software licenses to look at software license management from an entitlement perspective, meaning what do we own or what do we have the rights to use relative to the software we have. So entitlement and centric approach looks at the licenses that we purchased and the product use rights associated with those licenses or the contracts that govern them. And then calculating what we need in terms of those licenses, comparing what we have available to the usage patterns, and not so much focusing on the individual devices on which software is installed. That's certainly an important element, but again, with cloud proliferation, we are quickly moving away from the historical or traditional or even legacy approach to installed software. And it's now really more about a service-oriented software usage or user-based or subscription-based. And so this is important because there are only a few solutions on the market that have adopted this approach. CA, Software Asset Manager, is certainly one of them. And it is truly a critical success factor in approaching a SAM program or a software license management program in general. The next one factor under defining your program is to set expectations. This is something we see time and time again when we're working with customers, and that is that there's typically an idea that customers have of a one and done, right? Kind of the big bang, and that is, okay, we're going to implement the tool, we're going to establish the integrations that are necessary to bring data, get data flowing into the solution, and we're going to stand back and kind of watch the magic happen. And that's a misnomer. And I think there's some common sense to be applied here, but it's important to remember and to set expectations that employing a software license management program is a journey. It takes time. Sometimes, to achieve the long-standing objectives of effectively managing the majority of our software portfolio can take months and even years. And we'll see as we progress through this presentation why that statement is true. But it takes time, and an incremental approach is really the only successful way to approach this. The next one is the idea of establishing a baseline or a starting point. Too many times we work with customers and they don't have a clear understanding of where they are today from a maturity perspective, how much of a handle they have on their procurement practice, if you will, software procurement practice, and kind of what that starting, that jumping off point is in terms of reaching the objectives that have been established. And so it's important, again, to set expectations to ensure that your executive sponsors have a clear picture of where we are today relative to our expertise, our the current state of affairs in terms of what we own, even an understanding of the hardware estate that we have, which I'm not going to touch too much on that. And it's important not to sugarcoat this. Often we see that, again, expectations, kind of going back to the journey statement I made earlier, is we don't really have a clear picture from a tool perspective, a people and a process perspective, and generally in terms of overall practice maturity, where we stand. And so that can actually set us up for failure before we even leave the gate. So important to establish a starting point or a baseline of where we are, so that it's difficult to know where you're going if you don't know where you're starting. The next one is around defining compliance. And this is an interesting one. It's important to understand the nuances that make up software license management in your organization. And it may very well be different from organization to organization. And while it sounds silly, it would probably surprise you to know how important this is and how often organizations will, different groups, stakeholder groups within the organization will define the compliance. If you're an organization that's governed by a number of regulatory requirements or government rules or policies, having an understanding of what those are and what the requirements are is essential. In that we've seen scenarios where significant investments have been made. We reach the end of the implementation portion of a program and look back, and it turns out there's a miss. And some of these are simple things that get overlooked. So you have to know this before you start to plan your program. There has to be a clear understanding of what compliance means. Is that the ability to respond to an audit in a particular time frame? Is it understanding the difference between a standard audit from an external vendor and an internal one? Is it an organizational policy issue or initiative or a regulatory issue? And then, of course, understanding the impacts of those. So shouldn't assume, important to define what is meant by compliance. And then kind of extending beyond that, establishing standards and definitions within SAM. Again, this is something that we see so often with customers, and we have different, we've established a different set of rules depending upon the role we play within the organization relative to software. Sometimes stakeholder groups will have a very operational focus and less legal or financial. And so we may use the same words to describe something, but when we get down to defining what that something is, they're completely different. So important to establish not just the meaning of compliance, but to have an understanding of the kind of the key terms and conditions. And we've gone so far in at least in my past in implementing these types of programs to document those standards and to develop a lexicon so that when we bring that core team, that core stakeholder group, there's a clear understanding of what is meant when we refer to software license management, or the word software, or a license, or an allocation, or a contract. I think many of you that have been in this space for a long time are probably nodding your heads up and down, and that it can be a real challenge, and we have to stop each and every time to say, well, what do you mean by that? So again, another important success factor here in defining your program. And this is an interesting one, aligning procurement processes. So if the organization that's responsible for buying software and for sourcing, if you will, doesn't have an understanding of kind of the downstream requirements for terms and conditions that have been negotiated, there can be a huge miss. And so it's important for us, and the idea here is to kind of begin with the end in mind and acknowledge the fact that there's an opportunity that will come with implementing a program, and the opportunity would be to optimize our processes around the sourcing and procurement of software. Some simple examples would simply be to understand the soft cost of negotiating a non-standard agreement. This might be specific to a business unit that's implementing a system to drive new business within the organization, or the cost of managing unique one-of-a-kind terms within a volume purchase agreement. And the classic example I use so often is we have a very large customer in the financial services industry that negotiated a particular term, an all-you-can-eat, effectively, an all-you-can-eat license for a particular software product. And this was a long-standing conversation that took place between the vendor and the customer. And effectively, the way it worked is they had for a particular fee that was negotiated, they were given an enterprise license, or effectively an all-you-can-eat license for the particular software in question. And that number could grow over time as long as that growth was what they called or defined as organic, meaning that the growth didn't occur as a result of a merger or an acquisition or that type of a company activity. Well, that's all good and well, but and so they got value. They paid the fee, and they were smiling because they feel like they negotiated a good deal. The vendor was happy because they got a nice upfront fee for the use of the software. But then it came time to manage that term, and it became virtually impossible over time to determine whether a capacity purchase was needed, because it's hard to track whether the growth that occurred, think of over quarters and years, whether that growth, that particular need was organic, meaning we hired new employees that represented the new use of software, or that came through a merger or acquisition. So, and again, these are simple examples, but it's an important one to understand kind of the downstream impact and what we call the soft cost of buying software in a particular way. And so there's an opportunity throughout the program, as we're onboarding new vendors and trying to get our arms around how we're going to effectively manage even a particular software title, for us to involve the procurement organization, ideally someone at a higher level in leadership, to be able to optimize those processes. And then this is kind of a project management 101, but identifying and managing risks. So SAM, or software license management, is multidisciplinary, meaning there are a lot of different sub-practices involved, operational in nature, financial, legal, and the list goes on. And so it involves a number of different stakeholder groups that are cross-functional across the organization, internal and external partners, and lots of moving parts. And that's simply because we are consuming an incredible amount of information to be able to produce the desired SAM outcomes. And each of those represents a singular risk, and in the aggregate can become significant if it's not carefully managed. And there are ways to address that, and we're going to touch on a couple of those today. But the super important one, and these risks need to be documented with a mitigation plan, escalation plan, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and then ongoing support. There's a word that we hear over and over. So we often work with customers to implement our tech stack, and obviously CA has a particular solution that we bring to market that helps customers in a significant way to implement these SAM, or software license management programs. But the fact is there are complexities associated with this, and the change, the volume and velocity of change occurring within the software world around how we license software, virtualization, the cloud, BYOD, IoT, et cetera. It's dizzying, and so the word overwhelming is something that we hear often from license managers or compliance teams, both at the onset and as they make their way through the various phases of a SAM program. So it's incredibly important to establish a support plan, and that involves a number of different elements, and examples would be ongoing enablement training, and that would be not just in terms of how to turn the knobs and push the buttons in a tool, but having an understanding of the underlying concepts around software licensing, and for those for those stakeholders within the program that have a particular vendor focus, to indoctrinate them on the licensing programs of vendors, and to ensure that they have mechanisms to be able to stay current on that, because it changes constantly. And then educating them in terms of the innovations that are occurring within the industry, so that they understand the licensing impact of adoption of change, right? So super important to have that in place, to have a program in place, a support program, to make sure that teams are enabled and are able to address roadblocks preventing them from achieving SAM or software license management objectives. All right, so that's the first, I guess you could call it, critical success factor, and that's really kind of drawing the box around the program, making sure we understand, obviously, the objectives, the key nuances, and the key elements that make up our software program, our software license management program. The next one is around partnerships, and I'm calling this critical success factor number 2. There are a number of success factors here, but we're going to touch on partnerships. And you know, we've all heard the statement, "It takes a village." Well, that is an understatement when it comes to SAM, or software license management. And that's because it touches virtually every area or aspect of our organization and requires partnerships both within and, in many cases, outside the organization. So it's certainly critical during the implementation phase, in that as I've used the word onboarding a couple of times, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit later, but it's the idea of addressing a license position for a particular vendor and executing on a set of tasks or activities associated with that vendor to be able to produce the desired outcomes, a license position, an optimization outcome, or others. It's also required that these partnerships be managed, and in organizations that I've worked with, they've used different terms, but business interface manager or BIM is one, and there are so many different terms, but establishing and brokering and maintaining, giving these relationships or these partnerships the care and feeding that they need is essential in order to have a sustainable program, and that we're going to be relying on all of these different functional groups and stakeholders to deliver the outcomes that we're responsible to deliver to our sponsors, whether it's a compliance report or other information that would support the business decisions that these leaders need to make. Again, cross-functional. A key challenge within the organizations and why these partnerships are needed is because in many cases the reporting structures of these cross-functional organizations roll up to many different people. And so having an executive level sponsor to help establish to set the tone and facilitate these partnerships is critical. And then ensuring that there's an approved plan, both from an implementation and a steady state or BAU perspective, is essential. So I'm going to touch just on a couple of other points. In many cases, less is more. We've heard that many times, and that is particularly true when it comes to developing that cross-functional team and establishing those partnerships. The screen here, and forgive the word chart, is a kind of a representative team that makes up many of the functional areas that are required to be able to deliver success on a program. and these may have different names, but the idea is this is a small group of organization or of stakeholders that represent the cross-functional teams that contribute to these outcomes. And so I can share just from practical experience that I was involved, in the late 1990s or early 2000s, and SAM as a concept was just becoming important in the industry. And our core team was 100 people. It's a large multinational organizations with offices in 40 countries. They had tens of thousands of end-user computing devices and very large data centers in key geographies around the world. Again, banking industry. And so we would have these half-day marathon meetings, including large numbers of people, and it was just ineffective and inefficient. And so establishing a core team that will assume responsibility and accountability for key outcomes is essential. And this is a graphical view. We use the kind of the blue figure in the background, which we call the A model, as a visual representation of the underlying processes that are needed to produce SAM or software license management outcomes. But there are a couple of core areas, each of which involves stakeholder groups, and you can see maintaining that repository or inventory of licenses and contracts involves a number of different groups, and you see a few examples there. And these may or may not report up to the same executive. The same is true in establishing the usage of software. We call it software inventory administration. But these would be the teams responsible for providing data to the solution and then applying business processes to that data to make it, to be able to produce the outcomes. And so, again, a number of different data sources, and we'll touch on this a little bit more in a few minutes. So, again, important to establish these partnerships, important to give them the care and feeding that they need, important to be represented at the executive level. And then there's one last one, and that is, in terms of partnerships, is understanding the environment. So the overall solution, SAM or software license management solution, is really a very large whole of many, many parts or many components. There are countless numbers of systems, if you will, whether they're internally developed or solutions that are made available by different vendors, industry vendors, that are going to contribute from a data perspective and or process automation, et cetera. So having a clear understanding of what those systems are, what they're capable of producing in terms of data, how they're architected is essential. So establishing a clear understanding of the organizational environment and all of the different systems or solutions that will contribute to and make up our software license management solution is essential, and the only way to facilitate that is through partnerships, right? And then again, mapping these back to our software license management. I'm confusing disciplines here, but software license management processes is important, and we often will see a pictorial view of that information that represents the overall SAM or software license management solution architecture, particularly the data integration architecture. And then once that's been established, it's important to manage change going forward, because we know the environment changes frequently. And so in a steady state process, when that change occurs, this goes back to just standard change management processes within an organization. It's important to maintain that partnership to ensure that we can measure and manage the impact of change across the organization. All right, so the next factor, and this is really the last one that we're going to cover today, is establishing effective process work streams. And this is the actual work that gets done, typically using a tool. We haven't specifically talked about tool selection as a success factor. I think it's implied here. But establishing work streams, process work streams, is essential. So we're going to cover off two of them today. There are a number of different work streams that need to be established and maintained over time. Before we get into the specifics, though, defining SAM processes is something that's often overlooked. We're in a hurry. There's a sense of urgency to be able to produce an outcome, and that's often because we're dealing with timelines associated with an audit. And so we forego the pleasantries or, some of the important elements of defining sustainable processes. But they are, in terms of a programmatic approach to software license management, they're critical. We have found that some customers, although few, have a good start. Even fewer are mature and have actually finished. And what I mean by finished is that they've documented those processes and they're able to produce the documentation and speak to them and then show examples of how those are implemented or have been adopted within the organization. More often than not, effectively many customers have not. And so this is an important element and part of the reason why it takes time and why that journey is in fact a journey, and that developing processes, as we all know, and more specifically adopting those, overcoming some of the cultural challenges that represents, the training that is required to adopt those, very important. And of course, it can't be siloed. Oftentimes, organizations that don't build partnerships will attempt to achieve these outcomes, whether as a one and done or in a sustainable way. And in either case, they're just simply not achievable. And there's a variety of reasons why. We've touched on a few, and we'll continue thematically to talk about those. Another aspect of these work streams is documentation in general, and specifically that kind of next level component, which is what we call work instructions, often overlooked as well. And it's for good reason. The cost and effort associated with developing work instructions is extensive. But given the fact that SAM is based on completeness and quality of data, and on the quality side requires a number of management processes to be implemented and in a sustainable way, having clarity as to our approach to managing and processing that data is essential. Even more important in medium and large organizations, and even more so when there's a geographic distribution where we've got a delegation model that, that crosses geography or crosses oceans. It's important to make sure that if we have two different resources managing or processing the same incoming information from our business systems, that they're doing it in much the same way so that the result would be similar, or if not exactly the same, regardless of who was, who is doing the work. So incredibly important to document work instructions. And it's investment, again, that is often overlooked because of the cost and time required to make that happen. So looking at some of the work streams here, I want to touch on two of them. And again, I'm going back to this data model, or this process model, I should say, we call the A model. The right-hand side basically represents everything that a customer or an organization has purchased or is entitled to use. And we call that the contract and entitlement work stream. And then there is what we call the data management work stream. The criticality of license and entitlement management just can't be overstated. It's a necessary evil. It involves not only building a historical view of the software purchases that we've made and the contracts we've executed over time, but then making sure that we're able to manage net new purchases that are made. This is a large part of a program, and it's recommended that it be done in parallel with some of the earliest activities in the process. In terms of time, this is probably one of the longest tentpole items of any program because of the work that's involved, and that is largely dependent upon the size and complexity of an organization. The data management work stream involves overall the largest number of people within the organization, and it's incredibly distributed because it touches all of the different management systems that are going to be feeding data into the solution, into the SAM solution, to produce the result, to be able to calculate what software is being used, and of course, ultimately what our license position is. So a number of these stakeholders, these data source owners, we call them, may not be directly related to or within the control of the core team. So this is what makes this, this particular work stream obviously very important and one of the largest in terms of overall effort within the program. It is also the hardest to manage. So I want to take just a brief look at these. When we talk about the contract and entitlement work stream, it should be independent and it should be governed by procurement or finance and not the software licensing team. And that's largely because the review of they certainly should be involved, but the review of contracts requires a qualified resource, or probably more appropriately would be resources. And it involves, in some cases, multiple groups because no contract is created equally, and they're typically unstructured, and there are typically a significant number of those. So compiling and aggregating the information, reviewing and analyzing the contracts to extract the relevant information to support SAM outcomes is important. Should be started early, again, because it's a long tentpole item. From a best practice perspective, our recommendation is to start with a list to prioritize vendors. Now, how those vendors are prioritized is up to individual organizations, but it could be based on financial spend or on the risk that that organization represents in terms of audit or under licensing. It's important that the information, that the review that occurs, the analysis that occurs is again done by qualified resources, because the quality of the information that comes out of those could have a significant impact, and I always call it $1 million impact for even a single product or vendor that we're managing. This particular work stream can potentially be the most significant risk to a program. That's, again, because of the extensive effort required and the complexity associated with doing the work, again, by qualified resources. It's often underestimated. Again, we have a large customer in the UK that has literally tens of thousands of contracts, and they have a dedicated team of, I think it's close to 40 people, and they've been working on this for a number of years now across their software estate. And they recently determined that this particular effort would be best served by outsourcing it to industry experts, that the singular focus is on the contract component of software licensing. So again, important in terms of the quality of the resources, the qualifications or competencies of the resources. Again, important to prioritize. Another recommendation we make is to make the initial focus on contracts that are active, and of course the purchasing information associated with that, because that review and the analysis of those current contracts will help to determine whether or not some of the historical, upstream or downstream agreements or earlier agreements may be or may not be relevant. And then again, there needs to be a sustainable process, and this goes back to establishing partnerships and also considering optimization opportunities in terms of how we negotiate our contracts with these vendors and then how we buy software. The other one is the data management work stream, and I'm going to wrap up here very soon. But in terms of the overall, I guess, effort and the people involved, this is kind of the big fish, if you will. It involves establishing a data integration architecture. Remember that the data required to support a SAM outcome, which typically one of the first ones is a compliance or a license position. If we're looking at software that runs throughout the enterprise, including external vendors like cloud providers, some of the common ones that we would know about would be Office 365 or Creative Cloud, platform as a service providers, etc. So it's not just internal data. It involves establishing integrations to automate as much of this as possible with key data sources. So if we look at it from an onboarding perspective, and I described briefly what that term represents, in a phased approach, which is always recommended, 40% or 50% of all of the activities associated with this program or with this work stream would happen in phase one. And that's because we don't necessarily know what data we need as we're working our way through a particular vendor and onboarding that vendor. And I often talk about these three magical questions that have to be asked in terms of understanding what is needed from a data perspective to produce the outcomes, right? The questions are, what data do I need? In other words, when I look at the licensing rules from a vendor associated with a particular product, there's a calculation that has to occur. If you think of that as a formula, so that formula is expecting certain inputs. And that's the data that I'm describing. So the question is what data do I need? Where do I get that data? Meaning what system or what data source contains that data in a managed fashion? And that could be inventory or discovery tools, that could be virtualization platforms, that could be cloud service providers, that could be financial systems, and the list goes on and on. A CMDB is another common one. What data do I need and where do I get it? Those three questions, or I'm sorry, what data do I need, where do I get it, and how? What's the best method? And that goes back to the data integration architecture. Do I implement a sustainable integration? We call that a connector. If my reporting period is only quarterly or even annually, it may not be worth the investment to implement an integration. It might be easier, faster, and cheaper to simply go and manually collect that data on a quarterly or on an annual basis if that's what my reporting cadence is for that particular title or vendor. And then in subsequent phases, there's additional work. There's even greater activity because we may need to refine or update those integrations to capture different or more data because those questions keep getting asked on a title by title and vendor by vendor basis. So data management work stream is an ongoing activity. Completeness and accuracy of the data that we're capturing is essential because the result is going to be based largely on the data we're capturing, and if it's not complete, if it doesn't represent the entirety of the usage of that software product or solution in our environment, then it's going to be reflected in the result. And if that data is bad, if it's just not good data, it's not managed, if it's not kept current, if it's stale, or if it's simply inaccurate, again, that could represent $1 million mistake from a software licensing perspective. So that's the core. This workshop that I described typically is delivered over an 8-hour period, and so I've touched on only some of the key elements. There are other success factors like automation, like tool selection, but I wanted to just cover off some of the key ones that would contribute to a successful software license management program. And to summarize, defining the program, developing and maintaining partnerships, and establishing effective, sustainable work streams are essential in developing any software and implementing any software licensing program. So that's the content of the presentation today. And I think, Chris, I'll pause now and just turn it back over to you for Q&A.
Yeah, Mike, this is Alan House. I'll pick up the Q&A here. I did catch a couple questions that came in. Again, everybody, you can click on the Q&A button there and enter your questions. Just make sure you respond to everyone when you put those in. And Mike, there's a couple here I'll just start off with. One asks about, it says we're hearing about a convergence of asset and IT service management, SIAMs, service integration and management. What do we need to do to prepare for it? Is it really coming?
It's actually not coming, it's already here. And we could do another community webcast on SIAM and multi-supplier integration, but the basic idea is that IT has moved from being a service provider to a service broker. So it simply means that we're working with many parties, many, if not, and an increasing number are outside of our firewall, or actually external service providers. We call them tower providers. And so having a governance model, again, a data integration architecture, the ability to exchange information, meaningful information, whether it's service level KPIs or software licensing information, particularly when the service providers are actually providing software services there's entirely different licensing models that apply to service providers that just wouldn't be applicable in an internal organization. So kind of establishing that integration architecture and then a governance model to support that is what is essential. And what we're going to see over the coming, we're beginning to see it, but we're going to see a number of tools or solutions that are specifically targeted to address this challenge, where you have external organizations and that are contributing to or supporting processes or process outcomes. And remember here that the lens that we're looking through when it comes to the software services is through the eyes of the end user. And so they're looking for high quality and seamless services. And so the idea of being able to, for example, facilitate a request for a particular software or software service, our ability to effectively manage that request and fulfill it in a way that's speedy, that doesn't require the user to, do a lot of heavy lifting, and that ensures that it's kind of continuous is essential. And that's kind of the SIAM or multi-supplier integration perspective.
Mike, there was one other question here that sort of borders on this, and SIAM is the one thing that everybody needs to be looking at. What else besides virtual and cloud is on the horizon that will make SAM more difficult in the future? What can we do now to minimize that? So I guess, are there any other besides SIAM that are about to hit us?
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the key security is one, and that is that we have different providers delivering software services, and so understanding the security implications of that and plugging those vulnerabilities or the vulnerabilities associated with that is one. And that's probably one of the fastest growing areas where, and it's on the minds. There have been a number of industry studies or analyst reports talking about the fact that security, which is largely related to software, whether internally developed or purchased through external organizations, is a top 3 priority for CIOs. So that's certainly one. While this isn't a new concept, with the consumerization of IT and these concepts of bring your own everything, that can be, any device classification or any interface is a challenge in that the way that legacy licensing rules are written, they just simply don't support a lot of those concepts. That's changing, but there are, in the top, 5 or 10 vendors, the Microsofts, the Oracles, the IBMs, some have made more progress than others, but it's still an area where definition is needed. And the analogy that I can give is, you guys probably remember 10 years ago where they talked a lot about legislation within the U.S. government had not caught up to modern technologies, and so we simply didn't have laws to support some of the use cases when challenges were made or legal disputes occurred, right? The same applies here. The licensing rules just simply aren't defined in such a way they support these use cases, and this is particularly related to things like BYOD and cloud, et cetera, et cetera. IoT, or Internet of Things, yet another area where, again, we're just beginning to get our arms around it. So those are just a few. You're going to see vendors, software license management vendors, including CA, begin to talk more and more about these in various forums and industry events, and are going to begin to, talk about the capabilities that they're bringing to market to support these new modern technologies and trends.
Great, good answer. If anybody's got a question, they can type it in, or you can hit #6, and that'll unmute your line, and you can just jump right on here with a question. Mike, one last question I see is any new license models on the horizon beyond what you just discussed? So I know you went through some new things. Any other additional license models that are about to hit that might have big impact on us?
So for me, it's less about the new ones. It's although there are new ones being introduced every day, and remember, the goal with these license metrics or models from the vendors are they're looking for a way to monetize their software, right? And they're looking to extract. And I'm a software company, so I have to be be careful about some of these statements, but the basic idea is they're all in it to make money. They're making significant investments to develop software, and historically, this is less true now because vendors are receiving market pressure to simplify licensing, but it's almost a fool's errand. But there are new ones being introduced every day. And the big challenge is, while many of them are manageable in terms of it's possible to implement a process to capture the necessary data to perform the calculations based on those licensing rules. Where it becomes untenable is where the licensing rule is simply not enforceable. There's no way. There's no practical way to measure the use of the license or the software in the way that the vendor describes. And then the other big challenge that we're seeing is as cloud adoption occurs, and I'll share with the group that there are some of the most prominent brands in the world have programs or initiatives in place to accelerate cloud adoption. And I was in the office of the CIO of a very large financial institution here in the U.S., and the CIO made a statement that they had an internal commitment to migrate 40% of their software portfolio to the cloud within 2 years, which is aggressive, and I would even submit unachievable to a great degree. And the reason is, and this was stated in the meeting by the CIO, is he has no tools and no solutions available to help him understand the cost implications and the benefits and risks of moving that. So the benefits are often articulated in a very simple way, but there are significant risks, both from a cost and a legal perspective, in kind of migrating these legacy licenses that are owned to these new licensing models. And I'll tell you, these are all consumption-based, and vendors are working very hard at ELA renewal time to convert customers into a new model, and then, of course, sell them as much software as they can or services as they can to increase revenue streams. And so having tools that actually analyze usage of software services, and think of the example of buying infrastructure or platform as a service and the usage patterns associated with that, and being able to run optimization analysis to say, hey, am I actually using all of the services that I'm purchasing? Are there similar services available from other providers that have an architecture that will support my business needs? Those are the types, that's the direction in which SAM as a discipline or as an industry is headed. And it's still risk-oriented, but it's moving largely from a risk proposition to optimization, right, more and more. So I don't know if that answers the question directly in terms of what license models have I seen. I've seen some pretty hairy ones. It's great to discuss them over a beer and a pizza.
I guess that's an open invitation to everybody on the call here. So,
there you go.
All right, that's the set of questions that I saw here. If anybody has any last ones, just jump on the line, press #6 to unmute and ask. Otherwise, we're going to start to wrap up here. I want to thank Mike for the session and for all of you for attending. We do have another session on ITAM set up for the 29th of August, and that covers the hardware asset management side of things, advanced tips and tricks to successfully manage hardware assets with CA ITAM. That'll be given by Tim Rasmussen from CA as well. There's also another section that I'll make sure I post a discussion out on the community here that a partner of ours will be doing on cybersecurity. I know Mike mentioned that security is a big thing and that SAM plays a big role in that. So that'll be a very interesting one. It's going to be probably the second or third week in August, so stay tuned for that one. And I know we just delivered one a few weeks ago. And that's also, there's a discussion out there and a blog out there on that. So if you're looking for more depth on ITAM and software asset management specifically, make sure to check out these webcasts. They're all very informative. Some are best practices, others are more product focused. So, and the last thing is make sure you click on the poll button and give us some feedback as to how this session was for you. And with that, unless I hear Chris jump in, I think we'll call this a wrap, and thank you to the attendees and to our presenter once again. Thank you.